Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where today we are in part 2 of what we talked about last week. This is 2 Kings 5. This is the second half of the chapter, verses 15 through 27. Now, usually, I am trying to follow the scripture reading, the scripture reading that the church here has that's put together. We're going through the Old Testament and the New Testament. We're just reading bits and pieces of both of them at the same time, and so I usually like to preach Sunday morning on something from the previous week's reading. However, that's what I did last week, and we covered 2 Kings 5, verses 1 through 14, which is the story of Naaman. And then I thought about it and said, well, okay, yes, I do actually want to come back, and instead of moving on, I think we finished 2 Kings 10 last week, and so we're much, much further than 2 Kings 5. I want to come back and talk about 2 Kings 5 anyway. This is the second half of that story, the Naaman story, if you remember that from either having seen the last one or just knowing it in general. We have the Naaman situation and that whole story, and this is part 2 of that. This is where the story wraps up. Naaman isn't gone yet. This is actually when he returns to Elisha and has a bit of a conversation further. But instead of focusing on Naaman as the main character, this half of the story really deals with Gehazi as the main character, Gehazi being Elisha's servant. He is potentially the guy who was the messenger who took the message to the, potentially even to the king of Israel in the earlier part of the chapter. It could be the messenger who went back and forth between Elisha and Naaman in chapter 5 and verse 10. We're not actually sure who Gehazi is in relation to Elisha. All we're told is he is a servant, and we're told that a servant of Elisha has done a couple of these things. So maybe it's the same guy, maybe they're different. I'm not actually sure. Just kind of a suggestion. What you do find out here is that Naaman has learned, and he's doing about as well as he possibly can, which is pretty good for a heathen from Syria. But what you also find out here is Gehazi, who realistically should and does know a lot more than Naaman does, and should be a lot more righteous than Naaman is, and should be a lot closer to God than Naaman is. Gehazi is actually further from God in all of these different ways. He decides that he will take the opportunity to turn evil, whereas Naaman took the opportunity to turn righteous. This is a reminder to us that even people who are quote-unquote well-established in the faith, a lot of times we can have greater issues or blind spots than the people who are just totally unaware of who God is. And that is a disappointing and mildly terrifying reality. So let's read this story. You may well be familiar with the second half of it, but probably not as familiar as with the first half. 2 Kings 5, I'll start reading in verse 15. Then he, that is Naaman, returned to the man of God with all his company, and came and stood before him. And he said, Behold now, I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel, so please accept a gift from your servant now. But he said, As surely as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will accept nothing. And he urged him to accept it, but he refused. Then Naaman said, If not, please let your servant be given 2 mules' load of earth, for your servant will no longer offer a burnt offering, nor a sacrifice to other gods, but to the Lord. Regarding this matter, may the Lord forgive your servant. When my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there, and he leans on my hand, and I bow down in the house of Rimmon, when I bow down in the house of Rimmon, may the Lord please forgive your servant in this manner. He said to him, Go in peace. So he went some distance from him. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha the man of God, thought, Behold, my master has spared this Naaman the Aramean by not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him. So Gehazi pursued Naaman. When Naaman saw someone running after him, he came down from the chariot to meet him and said, Is everything well? And he said, Everything is well. My master has sent me, saying, Behold, just now 2 men of the sons of the prophets have come to me from the hill country of Ephraim. Please give them a talent of silver and 2 changes of clothes. Naaman said, Be sure to take 2 talents. And he urged him and tied up 2 talents of silver in 2 bags with 2 changes of clothes, and gave them to 2 of his servants, and they carried them before him. When he came to the hill, he took them from their hand and deposited them in the house, and he sent the men away, and they departed. But he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said to him, Where have you been, Gehazi? And he said, Your servant went nowhere. Then he said to him, Did my heart not go with you when the man turned from his chariot to meet you? Is it a time to accept money and to accept clothes, olive groves, vineyards, sheep, oxen, and male and female slaves? Therefore the leprosy of Naaman shall cling to you and to your descendants forever. So he went out from his presence afflicted with leprosy, as white as snow. Gehazi does something really dumb here, and we'll discuss this as we go through, but Naaman, who has taken this opportunity to learn who God is and to learn how impressive God is and how amazing God is, Naaman is actually benefiting from this, whereas Gehazi is just taking the opportunity to try and take advantage in a business transaction, basically just making as much money as he possibly can to his personal benefit. At least so it seems. We'll have a little consideration on that later, but for now, that's a fine basic assumption. A lot of times we focus on the greed of Gehazi, which is good, and that's definitely there, I think. But again, we'll leave that for kind of the second section in this. First, we need to talk about Naaman and the real setup and the response that's happened in this section. What you have first is a little section that builds faith, which is nice. You see Naaman as he's trying to put the building blocks together. Remember, Naaman is from Syria, or Aram, same country, different name. I'm not exactly sure why. I probably should have looked that up in between the last sermon and this one, but I haven't yet. Hopefully I'll remember before Sunday. You have Naaman, who is a foreigner. He is against Israel. He has always hated those people. He is like their mortal enemy. And so he hasn't really had much exposure to God before this, but now he finally does. Naaman in Syria would bow down, in places like the house of Rimmon, wherever that is, he would bow down to worship some gods that Syria had, and they would be, the local deities. He wouldn't have given much thought to Israel's God. But now, as Naaman has seen some things, and as Naaman has been very impressed with who God, the Lord, is, he suddenly is converting. That's the one positive in this section. Naaman is actually, he returns to Elisha. He has been cleansed. His skin is clean from his leprosy in verse 14. And now Naaman knows God. You have Elisha, who previously had stayed inside. And last week we made a big point about how it's kind of rude for Elisha to summon Naaman to him, and especially for Elisha then to not even come out and speak to him. There's a big point made about how Elisha is inside the house and he sends a messenger out, and there's a barrier erected between him and Naaman. It's like Elisha is emulating God and sending the priests back and forth, but Naaman's not allowed into God's presence. Well, now that Naaman is cleansed, Elisha actually comes out to see him. Verse 15, he returned to the man of God with all his company and came and stood before him. Not what we saw in verse 10, in verse 9, where he stood in the doorway of Elisha's house and Elisha sent a messenger to him, but now Elisha is there with him. There's been a removal of the barrier. The purification and the cleansing has happened, and now Naaman stands present with Elisha. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Elisha, who previously stayed inside, who previously was representing God in the separation, is now representing God in the reunification and the reconciliation. A man has been cleansed, and now he is welcome in the presence of God. No more barrier. Now that Naaman knows a bit about God, now that Naaman has taken that lesson to heart, now that Naaman has shown obedience, now he's included in the presence of the man of God, and in many ways in the presence of God himself. It's a beautiful picture of that little bit of reconciliation. And you notice it's not just like this external picture where Naaman is now allowed in the physical presence of Elisha, but you notice it's also an internal change. And that's the real reason why there's been an external change, is because there has first been an internal change. Naaman, when he comes to Elisha, is blessed, is like externally blessed, and he is taking the opportunity to be blessing others. First, you see an honoring of God in verse 15. Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. Second, you see an honoring of Elisha. So now, please accept a gift from your servant now. So please accept a gift from your servant now. There's this kind of two-pronged approach. Number one, Naaman knows that no mere man healed him. A point made last time is, Naaman himself said in verse, I think it was 12, he could have, Elisha, I was expecting him to come out and wave his hand all over the place and heal my leprosy. That was verse 11. And he didn't. Well, one reason for that, I proposed last time, might be because if Elisha did the healing, then it would really look like Elisha saved him, and God wouldn't be a factor in this at all. But because Elisha sent him away, and because it's very clear God did the healing through the waters of the Jordan River, it's very clear who did the healing, and now we glorify God. It's not, Elisha, you're so great, you healed me. It is, I know that there is no God in all the earth except in Israel. And also, I know you're his servant, so thank you for helping. Naaman knows no mere man healed him, so the glory goes to God, but Naaman also knows that Elisha, even though Elisha isn't the one who's providing the power to heal him, Elisha is the one who is the go-between, who is the connection to God and kind of the source of those things. And so he does honor Elisha as well, and he tries to give him money. There is no confusion on who's the great one, right? It's much like Peter and John healing in Acts chapter 3. It's not us who did this thing, it's the fact that Jesus exists. He's the one who did it. He's the important one. Honor him. It's that same kind of push. It's not that Elisha is replacing God, and it's not that Naaman thinks Elisha replaces God, but it is, hey, Elisha, you were the provider here, and so thank you, and he shows him gratitude. In this instance, it's noteworthy that Elisha says, no. In verse 16, as surely as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, right? We're honoring God. I'm not going to take this from you. Curious. The laborer is worthy of his hire. Well, Elisha has every right to go in and say, well, sure, I can get pay from that. I can draw pay from that because I did the work, right? I did provide the connection. Like, God's the one who cleansed the guy, but I provided the connection. So, sure, I'll take some money from you. But Elisha says, no. I don't know exactly why he does this. I think it's probably something to do with keeping the glory on God and not for himself. There is a refusal to enrich himself. It could be, I don't want to get rich off of other people's suffering. It could be a sentiment like that, but I think it's probably just a generic sentiment like, let's not confuse Naaman. Naaman is new to this whole faith thing, and so instead of getting in his way and demanding money from him or even receiving money from him, even though it's nice of him to offer, let's not do that. Let's keep the focus on God where it belongs. I'm not sure exactly why, but nobody ever said he had to take it, so it's not bad for him to refuse. I just don't know the exact reason as to why he does so. Naaman, when he sees this, he tries to push Elisha to take it, and Elisha keeps on saying no, and so Naaman eventually says, okay, fair enough, but I have one more thing that I would like from you. And here's what he asks. It's interesting. He wants a way to worship God. And he does this, he kind of has this approach in two different ways. Naaman is convinced that God is the only real deity at this point. Verse 15 is his confession of that, right? There is no God in all the earth other than the one in Israel. This is the real God. I want to worship him. Naaman goes so far as to say in verse 17, I am no longer going to offer a burnt offering or a sacrifice to other gods, but just to the Lord. Right? I'm going to be faithful to God and God alone. He's convinced that God is the deity, but there's a problem with that. He isn't Hebrew, which means he doesn't really have access to God. He can't even actually go inside the temple. And the temple is the only place you can offer sacrifices to God. It's not like he can really convert to Judaism. It's not even called Judaism at this point, but you understand the anachronism. It's not like he can really convert to that. He lives in a different country. He lives in a vastly different area. He lives among a vastly different people. Theoretically, he could maybe convert, but I don't even know what that looks like and how does that function. Maybe that works, but also the odds are the Israelites at that time, who are mortal enemies with the Syrians, probably wouldn't let him convert, probably wouldn't help him do so, probably wouldn't accept him into association with God, regardless of whatever he does. And so there's still this barrier between him and God. A blessing of the New Testament is we don't have those kinds of cultural or ethnic barriers anymore. You can be Christian whoever and wherever you are. But in the old world, it was a consideration. And under the old law, this was a consideration where it was salvation for the Jews, and then you had a bunch of Gentiles who maybe, without the law, did the things of the law. Maybe this is the kind of person that Paul's referring to when he says that over in Romans. How can he worship? How can Naaman worship acceptably from this foreign land? Well, the answer is he really can't, but he's going to do the best he can. And so he takes earth from Israel, 2 cartloads, 2 mules load of earth, to build a little home away from home for God, basically, to build a little altar there so that he can worship on Israelite soil, even though he's far away in the land of Syria. That is God's land. The physical land of Israel was God's land, at least in this era in time. And so Naaman says, well, I'm trying to worship God. He clearly wants to be worshipped in this land. Let me do my best to find a patch of land I can worship God on. Of course, he's still missing the priests to offer the sacrifices, and he's still missing the temple that's the appropriate place to offer the sacrifices. But this is, in many ways, the best that he can do, or the best that he's aware of that he can do. Naaman is trying, even though he's missing some parts of it, he is absolutely trying to be faithful. He also has a quick note that he has a work conflict with this worshiping. In verse 18, part of my job as the military commander is to go into the house of these other gods, these false gods. Now that I know that they're false gods, I can call them false gods. It's to go into the house of Rimmon and pray to these other deities. Elisha, I don't know what else I'm supposed to do. I can't, if I'm the military commander, I may have to do that. And if I do have to do that, I want God to know that I don't believe in those other gods, but it's part of the work experience that I have. It's part of what's required of me. I don't exactly know what to do. And so, just preemptively, God, please forgive me for doing this. I'm not losing my faith in God. It's just, I have to, right? I am in this bad situation. Part of being a general requires him to bow to the false gods in the area. It's not that he believes in them, but he still gets forced into it. It's curious. That's a curious consideration, because Elisha does say, go in peace. It seems that God is willing to show mercy, at least in this instance. And we have to ask why that is. I think a lot of people would jump on this kind of example and look at this and say, well, if Naaman had a work conflict with worship, and he was preemptively forgiven, and so it's fine for me to, take employment that makes me work all day Sunday, and I can't actually go worship God, but I can just pray about it and be preemptively forgiven because of what I already have. Well, I'm not sure that that's the case. It's a very different situation, right? It seems like it's kind of similar because, you have this guy who's faithful in bad situations, and maybe you have a less than ideal situation, and you can still try to be faithful anyway. And so from that perspective, it seems similar. But also, we're talking about Naaman, to offer a sacrifice to God, would have to go, miles and miles into enemy territory where the enemies would kill him on sight to approach a temple that he's not even allowed to enter because he's a Gentile. And so there's no possible way for him to even offer a sacrifice to God in the first place. Whereas today, if you're a Christian, you can always offer a sacrifice to God. It's very, very different. We're talking about an age with this Jew-Gentile distinction where there is a major exception that is made for one specific individual in a really tough circumstance, and you can't really parallel that exactly onto an age where everyone has a much freer access to God, and there is no more Jew or Greek or slave or free or male or female, all are one in Christ Jesus. When you have stuff like that, that seems to counter or at least change the situation to such an extent. I wouldn't immediately say, well, if I have a work conflict, it must be fine because Naaman was fine. Naaman's in a very different situation than you are. So I wouldn't jump on that as an excuse, just kind of a consideration. Naaman is very much between a rock and a hard place, but seeks God anyway. He's righteous as much as he can be. And maybe that's the better comparison, is you need to be as righteous as you can be, which in this day and age, it's much easier, much more flexible to be righteous nowadays. And, it's a lot simpler for us to access God than it used to be. So take that for what it's worth. Naaman is doing his best to build up a faith for himself so that when he goes home, there will be difficulties, but he hopes to stay faithful to God anyway. Naaman's great. I really like Naaman, especially, He was very strong-willed and stubborn in verse 12, and very much like, I'm not going to follow this God is stupid, and then as soon as something happens to prove that God exists, well, never mind, I'm going to follow this God. He's very hard-headed and stubborn and is very faithful. So I hope to see Naaman in heaven. Of course, I have zero confirmation. We never see him after this point in the Bible, but I do have hope there. He seems to be on a good trajectory, and who knows exactly where that went. But now we have to switch around. Naaman was in an incredibly difficult situation, but decides to respond to God in faith. Gehazi, meanwhile, is not in a difficult situation at all. Actually, his situation is very, very easy, but he decides to ignore God and build up the wonders of his wealth anyway. It's a massive contrast between these two. When you think about it, Naaman is a Gentile. Gehazi is not, or even to a greater degree, Gehazi is not a Gentile. He's not just, an Israelite. He is a servant of the prophet of God, which means it's not just like, Gentiles are generically away from God and Jews are generically closer to God. It is Gentiles, it is even among the people who are generically closer to God, the servant of the prophet of God is about the closest you can get to being God, or to being near God, right? It's as close as you can be to worshiping correctly and to being right and to being in God's presence. Elisha himself is modeling God's presence for Naaman, and then Gehazi gets to be the guy who walks in between them. He gets to be the guy, at least one of, if not the servant, who plays kind of the role of the priest. He is so close to God. He has every reason to be faithful, and yet Naaman, who's in the difficult situation, talks about his faith. Gehazi, who's in the easy situation, talks about how much he wants more. Gehazi, up to this point, has been mostly fine, but something here makes him angry, and he changes. He gets irritable. He gets evil, is what he goes over to. Starting in chapter 5 in verse 20. Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, thought, Behold, my master has spared this Naaman the Aramean by not accepting from his hand what he brought. As the Lord lives, I will run after him and take something from him. It's interesting, that kind of language. He has spared my master Naaman. Or he has spared Naaman, not my master. My master has spared this Naaman. Sorry, I guess I just can't read sometimes. Naaman has been spared, according to Gehazi's way of thinking. A lot of times we focus on Gehazi being greedy because, yes, I think that's a main motivation. Yeah, it seems that he is greedy. But how often do we think about his vengeance? Elisha has spared him. Elisha has had mercy on him. Let me go back and take some things from him. The Syrian shouldn't get all that for free, is kind of the thought process that's going on. But again, it's not Gehazi's place to decide that, is it? And yet he wants to be the one who determines how much Naaman does or doesn't pay. It may be that he's greedy. I think that's definitely part of it. It may be that he doesn't like Syria or the Syrians. That's probably definitely a part of it too. It may be that he thinks Elisha's making a mistake and he would regret later not being paid. And so he wants to do something nice for his master. If you're trying to devil's advocate and argue that Gehazi is actually not that bad of a guy, maybe that's the route you go down. Well, I want to get some money just in case Elisha decides that later on he actually did want some pay for it, and then I can reveal, hey, I did get some pay for it, so it's okay. If you want to argue Gehazi is the selfless individual, that's probably the route you would go down, but whatever the case, it's not his place to contradict his master, and it definitely doesn't justify what happens right now, which is Gehazi starts to lie about these things. It's this curious little picture in... I'm sorry, I'm thinking about something else. That's a wrong little... that's a little note that is incorrect. That's in the other sermon, not in this sermon. It's this curious little picture that happens in verse 22, where Gehazi just straight up goes out and lies. He runs after Naaman. Naaman says, is everything well? And he says, yeah, everything's well. Two guys have come, and they need money and clothes. That's it. Did that happen? Well, there's never a note in the text that says it happened, so I assume that he's just kind of lying. Even if you try to argue that, his intentions are noble, Firstly, I don't think they were. And secondly, even if you try to argue that using the name of your master and the name of God to try and earn money for yourself by lying to a person who doesn't know any better is not noble, not righteous, and not good. And nothing you can say will justify those things because they're just wrong. Gehazi is lying, so that's a crime. But more than that, Gehazi is actually, it's not just that Gehazi is greedy or he's irritated at Naaman or really doesn't like the Syrians. It's not just that Gehazi is lying. Those things are true and they're not good. But it's also that Gehazi is interfering with the message of God that exists. God in James 1, if you lack wisdom, let somebody ask of God, who gives to all freely and without reproach. God tends to do this. He tends to act in this way, to give freely and to give without reproach. And yet, Gehazi is getting in the way of that. Elisha, up to this point, has been the delivery system through which God has given. God has given to Naaman freely. Naaman tried to pay for it, and Elisha said, no, I don't need that. It's free. It's a free gift. Take it and enjoy it and be blessed by it. That was free. And then Gehazi comes in and tramples all over that point by saying, actually, what if you did pay for it? Actually, since you're in our debt, why don't you give me some money? That sounds like a good idea. God is generous and Gehazi is not, and Gehazi is trampling all over the point. Because of Gehazi's actions now, when Naaman thinks about his journey to Israel, it seems like, oh, I went to Israel, I got healed, and I ended up paying them something in return. It seems like maybe I got healed for money, and you don't have to take it that way. But now it's possible to take it that way, whereas before, when Elisha said no money, it was not possible to take it that way. There was no way I could ever construe that as Naaman having paid for healing, but now that Gehazi has, taken some money from him, now it seems an awful lot more likely that, hey, Naaman has paid for healing. What does that do to the people in Syria who watch Naaman return? They see him return, they see him healed, and then they see how much money he just paid. What does that do for Naaman when he thinks back on this instance, thinking about how much he just paid? Because of Gehazi's actions, now it reflects poorly on God because it looks like God is giving things away for money. It looks like God is selling his services, not giving things freely. Elisha said no, God was not a hired help, and Naaman, it was clear, the point was clear for Naaman to understand, but now because of Gehazi's actions, now it's unsure. Just because you can take money for the payment doesn't mean that you should, and Elisha refrains to make a point with his refusal that Gehazi is now muddying the waters. This is not just greed from Gehazi. It's not just a lie from Gehazi. Those would be bad enough, but this is now a smearing of God's name as Gehazi comes in and interferes with the message being delivered. Why is the punishment going to be so severe in these last couple of verses? Because, I would suggest to you, because of that lack of respect that Gehazi has, because of that destruction and the sullying of God's name. Don't be greedy and don't lie. Those are bad enough. But above all, if you are going to be greedy and lie, do not do it in the name of God. God takes that seriously, even if we don't. And Gehazi is about to suffer because there is a special judgment awaiting those who defend evil with the name of God. Gehazi is just messed up from all sorts of different directions, but this is the big one, I think, is he has misrepresented God. He's gotten in the way of the representation of God. And now Naaman, who is so young in the faith and doesn't really understand God all that well, Elisha was doing his best to teach Naaman and help Naaman understand God. And Gehazi has come out and gotten in the way and basically confused the teaching. And now when Naaman goes back home, what will Naaman think? Again, I hope it's positive. I hope he clings to what Elisha showed him. But Gehazi makes that much, much more difficult. And that's when Gehazi comes back home. He hides the stuff. He pretends that he hasn't gone anywhere. And that's when you find out there's been a buildup of consequences. Don't do evil at all. It's not recommended. God does not like it. But when you are caught, if you are caught doing evil, right? If you do evil and when you are caught doing it, at the very least, don't double down on what you just did. Gehazi is not a good guy, but at least he would be more sympathetic if he confessed to his deeds. He would be evil, right? Just because you're sympathetic doesn't mean you're righteous. It doesn't mean you're right. You can still be evil and sympathetic. People can understand you and then disagree with you because you are doing wrong. But as is, he's not even sympathetic because Elisha says, Gehazi, where have you been? And Gehazi says, I haven't been anywhere. Which is, I mean, it's such a stupid thing to say, right? Gehazi has been away from the house for, I don't know, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever time it took for him to run all the way after Naaman, to stop Naaman, to get all the money back to the house, and then to bid Naaman's servants farewell. I'm not exactly sure how long that took, but, at least figure half an hour, right? Let's say that. Has Elisha not gone looking for Gehazi in the last half an hour? Has he not called out and heard Gehazi not answer? Has he not been aware that Gehazi is gone? More than that, isn't Elisha the man of God? Why would he not be aware of these things? See, Gehazi, Naaman is now aware of how great God is and how much God can do even for those who are far away from him. How much more does he keep tabs on those who are close to him? And yet Gehazi, for some reason, thinks God can be mocked and God can be fooled and thinks he can pretend that he was never away. He was just there. He was just a little hard of hearing, or Elisha didn't call loud enough, or Elisha doesn't know about where Gehazi's room is, or something like that. He just doesn't know. He's trying to obscure the truth when it's just a really stupid lie to tell. If I am gone from the house for 30 minutes and then I come back and somebody says, where were you? My answer is not, I was in the house the whole time. They've likely checked the house and know I wasn't there. Why would I even try to tell that lie? But money makes people do really stupid things. See, Naaman understood that God was aware and couldn't be fooled. God counted 7 dips into the Jordan River. He wasn't healed a whit before the 7th one, and he was completely healed after the 7th one. God was aware, but Gehazi, the one who is closer to God, Gehazi, the servant of the prophet of God, Gehazi, the one who is so close, who is raised in Israel and who is, familiar with who the Lord is, evidently doesn't understand that God is aware of things. Sometimes those closest to God know him the least. Elisha says, look, Gehazi, I know what you did. Verse 26, I know what you did. I was there, right? I was aware of that. My heart went with you. I don't know if that's just he saw him running from the window and knew what he was doing, or if God gave him some kind of divine revelation or whatever that is specifically. But he said, look, it's not the time for that, right? It wasn't the time. I was the one in charge of choosing if I would receive the reward or not, and I said no. That was the point. It wasn't time for the physical reward. Elisha wanted to make sure Naaman's healing was purely spiritual and no physical money entered into the equation, but Gehazi didn't. And so he's muddied the waters, and he's made things more confusing. How often have prophets in the Bible in the old times done their spiritual work and then specifically done it to get a paycheck? There are a bunch of false prophets, like in Jeremiah with Hananiah the prophet, who did this spiritual work of prophesying. Allegedly, he was saying words about the future, but he was doing it to get in with the locals and to make sure that everybody liked him and to win fame and fortune and popularity. Other prophets are false prophets. People who claim to be prophets are condemned throughout the real minor prophets in the Bible for going out to line their bellies, and they say whatever it is that people want to hear. It's true in the Old Testament with the prophet situation. It's true in the New Testament with the preacher situation. There are a lot of people who have itching ears, and so they seek out for themselves teachers. Or maybe you go through 1 Timothy is what the class is on, and it's talking about people who are teaching things that sound good to them and not actual truth. They're doing whatever it is to ingratiate themselves with the crowds or make themselves popular or famous or whatever it is, and they're not actually respecting who God is. They're doing the spiritual work, allegedly. They're doing a form of spiritual work to try and get a paycheck instead of to glorify God. It was true in the Old Testament. It's true in the New Testament. It's true in the modern day. How many preachers do you know, or how many Christians do you know who do the right thing or who do righteous stuff, but we do it for money instead of because it's the right thing to do? preachers especially the ones who get paid for the work that we do, that is one of the dangers, is sometimes and often you can find yourself preaching not because you actually care and not because it's a good message and not because it's the righteous thing to do, but because, that's where your pay comes from, and so you need to be preaching good sermons because that's how you get paid. By the way, as a local preacher, I can say this: keep a check on your local preacher, and if he's ever doing stuff just to get paid, maybe you should kick him out, because that's the Gehazi attitude. That's not the Elisha attitude. Money changes people. Elisha was over it, but Gehazi evidently wasn't, and he, instead of pushing back and saying no to his greed, he allowed his greed to spiral over into his destruction. And so Elisha issues a condemnation and a judgment in verse 27. Therefore, the leprosy of Naaman, it's now on you. Gehazi is cursed equal to what he tried to take advantage of, which is justice. It's a curious thing. In the Old Testament, you would have different laws. If you were in a trial and you were accusing someone of having murdered someone else and it was a false accusation, you were accusing them of that would get them the death penalty. Well, when it's found out you're trying to give someone else the death penalty, you receive the death penalty. You get equal to what you tried to take advantage of. You get equal to what you tried to do to other people. Gehazi, in this case, tried to take advantage of the leprosy, and so he received the leprosy. Not a perfect parallel, but it's that same kind of idea. God is interested in justice, equal and opposite reaction, and this is what Gehazi receives. If you tried to argue that Gehazi really had a good heart and Gehazi was just trying to get money for Elisha's sake, then Elisha is doubling down on rejecting the offering which he already did in the beginning. So get behind me, Satan. You don't need to keep throwing the same temptation at me, right? And it's perfectly justified from that situation. If Gehazi is just out to get the money for himself, which I think he is, then, well, now where is he going to spend it? He has all his money. That's great. Now you're in the leper's camp. What are you going to do with that now? You don't have a place in society anymore. You're white as snow. You're condemned with this disease. Now you are cast out. You are to live outside the cities and the camps with all the other lepers, and you will rot away. One of the reasons I think Naaman's leprosy was severe is because when Gehazi receives Naaman's leprosy, or a similar affliction, it is white as snow, and there's a lot of leprosy there. It's not just a little skin disease, not just a little patch of skin, but it covers him and it marks him forever. It's a reminder that evil never works out. Even if not immediately punished, evil never works out, and so don't be the one who invests in that. At least if you have your eyes on the spiritual, you'll know that it never works out. A lot of people don't. A lot of people have their eyes on the talents, on the clothes, on the money, on the whatever it is, the physical benefit. And so they think, well, Gehazi, he had a little bit of a disease, but he got away with a lot of money, so that was pretty cool. Or at least it was valuable to try and get the money, even if it didn't work out this time. A lot of other times it does, and money is good, and we should do stuff with money. What's more important to you? Is it more important to follow God, or is it more important to make bank? You know the answer. You know what the answer is. And I'm preaching this on Sunday morning. On Sunday night, I'll be preaching from Ecclesiastes 5 and 6 on the money and how worthless it kind of really is. Or on Friday, I'll release that same video, Monetary Meditations, I think it'll be called. Just that idea. Money really isn't worth what you think it's worth. Maybe don't invest in it so heavily. Maybe think about that just a little bit more. We all say that, God's glory is this important thing, but how many of us find it easy to be Gehazi, who will give up the glory of God to go and seek something else? Sometimes the people who are closest to God, sometimes the people who've been Christians for the longest, or the people who have the most experience with righteousness, or know the Bible the best, or have the longest decades of service, or whatever it is. Sometimes the people who are blessed the most take the most things for granted. And I often wonder, how much better would it be to be Naaman, who just wandered into God randomly and had a great experience, and now he's faithful, or trying to be. Even if he's not technically as correct, at least he's trying to be faithful. instead of Gehazi, who rejects being correct and rejects being faithful entirely to go and pursue something else. Be careful what you seek. Be careful what you go after. There's important things, and then there's money. And you don't want to find yourself in the position of Gehazi, sullying the name of God and bearing the consequence for it for the rest of your lives. Don't do that. Seek the actual, faith instead of just seeking money. Money's not going to do it for you. Gehazi Naaman is a tale of someone who is stubborn but eventually comes to faith. Gehazi is someone who is stubborn, who rejects faith, even though there's every reason for him to accept it and return. Disappointing, but one we should take a warning from. So, with that being said, thank you for listening. Hopefully that's something good to think about in terms of where you are at with God, something biblical, something truthful, something wise and helpful to consider. Hopefully you've enjoyed, hopefully you've benefited. God bless. And I'll see you on Wednesday for a class on 1 Timothy and Friday for Ecclesiastes.